Welcome to the Pan Am Podcast, brought to you by the Pan Am Museum in Garden City, New York. This podcast and our museum are dedicated to celebrating the legacy of the world's most iconic airline, Pan American World Airways. My name is Tom Betty, and I'm the host of this program. Thank you for joining us. The Pan Am Museum Foundation is a nonprofit organization. Please visit our website for more information at thepanammuseum.org. Again, our website is thepanammuseum.org. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. If you are using Apple Podcasts, please consider leaving a review. It will help others discover this program. This podcast is sponsored by the generous personal support of Mr. Adam Aaron, the CEO and chairman of AMC Theaters. He is also president of our sister organization, the Pan Am Historical Foundation. If you're not familiar with Pan Am, welcome. We are honored to have you here and for you to learn about what we're all about. If you already know of Pan Am, worked for or flown on the airline, or just love our history, it's good to be with you again. So with that, let's get this episode in the air, so to speak. Welcome aboard your Pan American Jet Clipper. In this episode, we are joined by Laurie Gwen Shapiro, a best-selling author, journalist, and NYU professor exploring lost history, art, and exploration. Her new book, The Aviator and the Showman, Amelia Earhart, George Putnam, and the Marriage That Made an American Icon, published by Viking in 2025, has been named one of the best books of the year by NPR, The New Yorker, Smithsonian Magazine, and The New York Post, and was a New York Times editor's choice. Drawing from a trove of new sources, including previously undiscovered audio interviews, Shapiro strips away nearly a century of mythology to reveal the real woman behind the legend and the complicated marriage that shaped her fate right up to her final flight. But before our interview with Laurie, let's set the stage, because the Amelia Earhart story provides important context to what was going on in this time period. Her story unfolds squarely in the middle of one of the most consequential decades in history, both in terms of the rise of aviation and the Great Depression. To understand why the Amelia Earhart story belongs in a Pan Am podcast, you have to understand what was happening in American aviation in the late 1920s. Because Earhart and Pan Am didn't just exist in the same era, they were orbiting each other from nearly the beginning. Juan Trippe founded Pan American Airways in 1927, the same year Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic solo and rewrote the world's imagination about what flight could be. Trippe was a Yale-educated former Navy flyer and one of the most audacious businessmen of the 20th century. His vision was simple to state and nearly impossible to execute. He wanted to fly the oceans commercially. Not as a stunt, but as a scheduled passenger service, on time every week. Pan Am's first route was modest, a mail run between Key West and Havana. But Trippe was already thinking bigger. By January 1929, Pan Am had opened a gleaming new international terminal in Miami and was inaugurating passenger service to San Juan, Puerto Rico, and Havana, Cuba. It was one of the most defining moments of early American commercial aviation. Standing on that new Miami tarmac on January 9th, 1929, was a who's who of the aviation world. Charles Lindbergh, now serving as Pan Am's technical advisor, Juan Trippe himself, and a young aviator who had become an overnight celebrity just 7 months earlier after crossing the Atlantic as a passenger aboard a plane named Friendship. And that person was Amelia Earhart. According to accounts drawn from Cuban period sources, including the Havana magazine Bohemia, Trippe saw Earhart as the ideal celebrity passenger to help launch his Caribbean expansion, and invited her aboard Pan Am's flagship aircraft, the Christopher Columbus, a Fokker F-10A captained that day by Pan Am's chief pilot Ed Musick for the inaugural flight from Miami to Havana. Think of it for a moment. The most famous woman in aviation, on the first Pan Am passenger flight to Cuba as Trippe's invited guest, representing a symbol of what commercial aviation could be. What is remarkable is that Trippe, Lindbergh, and Earhart were all on that Miami tarmac together that January morning, three of the defining figures of the aviation age, watching Pan Am's next chapter take flight. This was not a coincidence. Trippe understood something that Earhart's future husband and manager George Putnam also understood, that aviation in the late 1920s was as much about narrative as it was about technology. You didn't just build the routes, you built the story around the routes. And Amelia Earhart was the best story in aviation at this time, outside of Lindbergh, the most famous man in the world. Throughout the 1930s, Earhart and Pan Am continued to move in parallel, both in the business of making aviation seem not just possible, but compelling to an American public still learning to trust the idea of leaving the ground. Earhart promoted commercial aviation to women, an audience airlines desperately wanted to reach. Pan Am provided the infrastructure, expertise, and institutional credibility that no individual aviator could replicate alone. The relationship grew more practical as the decade went on. When Earhart began planning her round-the-world attempt, Trippe personally instructed his company to extend whatever assistance her team needed. Pan Am's Pacific infrastructure by 1937 was among the most sophisticated aviation support apparatus on Earth. Trippe was putting it at her disposal. And when Earhart was ready to depart on her final flight, she chose to launch from Miami deliberately so that Pan Am's mechanics, considered the best in the business, could spend a week going over her Lockheed Electra before she left the continental United States. Think about what that tells us for a moment. In 1937, at the height of her fame, preparing for the most dangerous flight of her career, Amelia Earhart chose to put herself in Pan Am's hands, a relationship that had begun on a Miami tarmac nearly a decade earlier. That trust was built over a decade, and it ran more than anyone else through one man, a navigator who had learned the Pacific serving for Pan Am on Pan Am's most important missions alongside Pan Am's finest crew. A man whose expertise Earhart would come to depend on, and whose fate would become forever tangled with hers. His name was Fred Noonan. Noonan had come up the hard way, more than 2 decades at sea as a merchant mariner, sailing around Cape Horn 7 times, working his way from deckhand to ship's captain before he turned his skills to the air. He was not a glamour figure. He was a technician, a craftsman of navigation in an era when getting lost over open ocean meant not coming home. By the early 1930s, Noonan had joined Pan American Airways, and Trippe put him to work on the assignment that mattered most, charting the transpacific routes. The Pacific Ocean is not forgiving of error. From San Francisco to Manila, the clippers would hop from island to island across thousands of miles of open water. Honolulu, Midway, Wake, Guam. Miss one, and there is simply nothing else out there. Noonan didn't miss them. He not only navigated those routes himself, he trained the navigators who would fly them after him. He did it alongside Pan Am's best people. The crew assembled for the crucial Pacific survey flights beginning in April 1935 were handpicked. Captain Edwin Musick commanding, First Officer Rod Sullivan, Radio Officer Wilson Jarboe, Engineer Victor Wright, and 2 names that matter for our story today, Navigator Fred Noonan and a young junior flight officer named Harry Canaday. We'll get to Harry's story a little bit later, and I have a special treat for you before our interview with Laurie. But Edwin Musick deserves a moment of his own here first. Musick was Pan Am's first hired pilot, the company's chief pilot, and by the mid-1930s, arguably the most celebrated aviator in America after Lindbergh himself. He was the kind of pilot other pilots studied, meticulous, demanding, quietly authoritative, and calm. His colleagues called him Meticulous Musick. He made the cover of Time magazine in December 1935 after commanding the China Clipper on its inaugural flight to Manila. He held more world flying records than any other pilot of his era, records for speed, distance, payload, and endurance. One historian put it precisely: Juan Trippe was the definitive airline executive, brilliant, savvy, and ruthless. But Ed Musick was the classic chief pilot, concise, hard-nosed, and utterly competent. And Fred Noonan was the navigational wizard who made the whole Pacific operation possible. Musick was also the man who repeatedly put Fred Noonan in the navigator's seat on Pan Am's most consequential missions. That endorsement mattered. When questions arose later about Noonan's reliability, and they did, it was Musick's judgment that sat behind him. Tragically, neither man would survive for very much longer. Noonan vanished over the Pacific on July 2, 1937, with Earhart. Just 6 months later, on January 11, 1938, Musick and his crew of 6 were killed when the Sikorsky S-42 Samoan Clipper exploded in midair near American Samoa during a survey flight to New Zealand. Within the span of a single year, Pan Am had lost its greatest navigator and its greatest pilot. 2 giants of the Pacific Age gone. Now let's chat a bit about Harry Canaday, who arrived at Pan Am in October 1933 as part of the airline's first class of college-educated, military-trained pilots, a new generation Pan Am was deliberately building to fly the oceans. As one of his crewmates would later recall of that group, quote, "There had never been a flying group like ours," end quote. Canaday flew alongside Noonan repeatedly during the 1935 Pacific Survey Program, first the survey to Honolulu in April, the first time a commercial aircraft had ever made that crossing. Then further west, Midway, Wake, all the way to Guam by October. These were the flights that made Fred Noonan's name. Fred Noonan had navigated the Pacific repeatedly, successfully, to islands so small they barely appeared on a chart. And when the China Clipper lifted off from Alameda on November 22, 1935, passing beneath the still under-construction Bay Bridge and pointing west toward Manila, Fred Noonan was in the navigator's seat and Musick was in command. Harry Canaday watched it all happen from the ground. And 2 weeks later, on December 9th, he was back in the navigator's seat aboard the Philippine Clipper, a Martin M130, Pan Am's second transpacific flight, helping prove that what Musick and Noonan had done wasn't a one-time miracle. It was now a route. When Amelia Earhart began assembling her team for the round-the-world attempt in 1937, Noonan was the navigator that kept coming up in every conversation, because he had done what no one else had done, and was recently out of a job at Pan Am and looking for work. Noonan had left Pan Am. The exact circumstances remain a subject of debate among historians, but what the record shows clearly is that Pan Am's own chief pilot had trusted him with the airline's most important missions, and Earhart's husband, George Putnam, recommended him as simply the best available. The exact reasons why Noonan left Pan Am has never been made clear through surviving documentation thus far. There are no termination records to turn to, nor the known existence of any correspondence that could provide clues. Some claim he left over pay disputes and rigorous demands of the airline on its employees. Others claim he was fired. But what should not be in dispute, through many primary source accounts, is that Noonan was known for his drinking. So it is reasonable to assume that this may have been a factor with his departure from Pan Am, although history is not crystal clear on the subject, and people that worked with him are on the record saying that they thought he left voluntarily. But Pan Am's connections to the Earhart flight ran deeper than just their former navigator. Trippe had extended the airline's full cooperation. Pan Am's Pacific radio stations were part of the communications plan. The direction-finding network Noonan knew intimately from his years flying the Clippers, the Adcock DF system stretching from Alameda across to Hawaii, Midway, Wake, and Guam, was on standby to help guide the Electra across the Pacific. On July 2, 1937, Earhart and Noonan departed New Guinea, bound for Howland Island, 2,556 miles of open ocean to a coral strip barely a mile wide. There was a Coast Guard cutter there waiting at Howland with fuel and radio. What followed became one of the most analyzed failures of communication in aviation history, and one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century. It is also, in ways that history has not always recognized, a Pan Am story, built on Pan Am's routes, enabled by Pan Am's infrastructure, navigated by Pan Am's finest. I'd like to go back to a gentleman I mentioned earlier named Harry Canaday, who retired from Pan Am in the late 1960s. Harry Canaday was not a household name, but he was one of a remarkable generation of pilots who did extraordinary things in relative anonymity. Born in 1909, he was among the first 6 pilots hired under Pan Am's new ocean flying training program in October 1933. A class that many describe simply as unlike any other group of aviators that had ever existed. They were young men with college degrees, military commissions, and hundreds of flight hours already behind them, being shaped into something that the world had never quite seen before: professional, long-haul ocean pilots. Within 2 years of being hired, Canaday had flown all 4 Pacific survey flights through the spring and summer of 1935, each one pressing further west than the last, in a stripped-down Sikorsky S-42 with the passenger seats ripped out and replaced with fuel tanks, navigating to islands so small they barely registered on a chart. Those survey flights paved the way for the China Clipper's inaugural run to Manila on November 22, 1935, one of the most celebrated moments in aviation history. Canaday is not wildly known today until now with this podcast, but what he witnessed and what he knew about Fred Noonan, about the Pacific, and about the world of aviation that produced the Earhart flight is extraordinary. And remarkably, some of it was captured on tape. Which brings us to a gentleman named Elgin Marion Long. Beginning in 1971, after completing his own solo round-the-world flight over both poles, a feat that earned him 15 world records, Long turned his attention to the mystery that had haunted him since his own years flying patrol missions over Howland Island during World War II. He just couldn't understand why Earhart couldn't find the island. What followed was one of the most dedicated research efforts in aviation history, in my opinion. Elgin and his wife Marie spent more than 25 years interviewing more than 100 witnesses and traveling more than 100,000 miles in pursuit of the truth about Earhart's final flight. Marie, a former public relations professional with the Western Aerospace Museum in Oakland, was Elgin's essential partner in the work, not just a collaborator, but the organizational mind behind the entire archive. Elgin always said he could tell you any detail about the Earhart case from memory, but Marie could find you the reference in the collection. Together, they built what became the most comprehensive oral history of the Earhart disappearance ever assembled, conducting recorded interviews with witnesses, Pan Am employees, Coast Guard radiomen, mechanics, navigators, and anyone who had touched the story. People who were there, people who flew alongside Noonan, people who heard Earhart's voice on that last morning and never forgot it. Marie Long passed away in 2003. Elgin Long followed in January 2022 at the age of 94, but their work endures. The recordings they made, more than 220 hours of audio across 156 interviews, were donated to the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, where they are preserved as the Amelia Earhart Project recordings. The donations came through David Jordan, founder of Nauticos, the deep-sea exploration company that partnered with Long on 3 expeditions to locate the wreck of Earhart's Lockheed Electra on the ocean floor. These recordings represent a primary source archive of extraordinary depth, and they were among the materials drawn upon by researchers, including Laurie Gwen Shapiro, in the preparation of her book, The Aviator and the Showman. Voices that might otherwise have been lost entirely, preserved because 2 people spent decades donating their time and passion making sure they weren't. Among those voices is Harry Canaday. Now remember, Harry knew Fred Noonan and flew with him on all the 4 landmark survey flights across the Pacific. When Elgin Long sat down with Harry for an interview, Canaday was 76 years old, a man looking back across half a century at events that had shaped aviation history. The year was 1985. Nearly 50 years had passed since Fred Noonan vanished over the Pacific. And yet, there was one of the men who had flown alongside him, who had navigated those same routes, who had stood on those same docks, and shared those same cockpits, still sharp, still precise, still carrying the memory of it all. What you're about to hear are recordings from the Elgin and Mary Long collection that are being aired publicly for the first time on this podcast. They are presented here courtesy of David Jordan of Nauticos and the Smithsonian Institution's Amelia Earhart Project. If I can make a quick editorial comment, to listen to these tapes is simply incredible. Let's start by taking a listen to Harry talking about his first job interview with Pan Am's Andre Priester. You will hear Harry with Elgin interviewing.
I had an interview with Pan American, and then they hired me.
And this must have been the latter part of 33 then, or the
That's
fall?
right, latter part of 33, because I went to work on January the 16th, 1934 for Pan Am down here, Guinea.
And they hired you in New York. Do you remember where you went for your interview?
Yeah, in the Chrysler building. And chief engineer, later vice president of engineering, Andre Priester. He's a Dutchman. And a good friend of Sikorsky. He hired me, and I reported here in Miami in January 1934.
And were you hired as a flight officer?
They called him apprentice pilot then.
Apprentice pilot.
And, of course, the primary job was co-pilot. But before we ever got in an airplane, we had to go through all of the maintenance training. In the hangar, we had to get an aircraft and engine mechanics license. And this was done during the first few months. And then you started, it's along there somewhere, you started radio training too. That is CW training, and you had to get a second-class radio telegraph operator's license. And they didn't have navigator's licenses then. Of course, navigating was pretty much just follow the coast and dead reckoning, you know. And so then you started flying. Actually, I think my first flight was made as a radio operator.
Did you get some navigational training, even though that would be redundant?
No.
You didn't.
That came along later when we started flying the oceans. You really needed navigation.
So it must have been around April or May again when you made your first flight for Pan American, finally earning money instead of getting training from them.
Yeah.
And see, at this point in time, you would have been 25 years old.
25 years old when I was hired, right?
Next, we're going to hear Harry talk about the first 4 survey flights he flew across the Pacific with Musick and Noonan in S-42 flying boats. You will also hear Harry's wife, Lucille.
By 1934 now, they were selecting the crew for the Pacific survey flight. At the end of 34, you found yourself had about 8 months of flight experience by then. Almost all of it as co-pilot.
Yeah, well, and co-pilot, and we had some combination jobs. That is S-38, where I had only the 2 pilots, and the co-pilot handled the radio and the flight mechanics duties. That is fueling the airplane and so on. So it was called a combination man: co-pilot, radio operator, flight mechanic.
Okay. And by now, they had ordered the S-42s, and in fact, by the latter part of 34, they'd already ordered the Martins.
They ordered the airplanes, I think, about 1931.
On the 42s.
42s.
They must have known when they hired you where you were going.
Well, I don't know about that.
Well, they were hoping. Well, I mean, they were looking for someone with the background that you had, the navigational background and the naval training.
Of course, they hired a lot of people. You know, they were mostly Navy and mostly military trained, Navy and Army.
And the S-42 has been delivered, and Captain Musick, in conjunction with other people in management, have selected a crew, I guess, for the Pacific survey flights.
Right.
And the first officer, I guess, that was selected is R.O.D. Sullivan.
Right.
Now, this comes to the relief pilot. Why do you think Mr. Kennedy was selected?
You said that.
Okay.
I don't know.
All right. Now, you were selected, and you knew that you were going to be transferred out to Alameda, and Captain Musick, I guess, was chief pilot.
He was chief pilot in the Eastern Division, which is Miami. They call it the Eastern Division then.
Mm-hmm. Did you call him Captain Musick? Or
yeah.
Captain was a proper...
Right. Never called him Ed in my life to his face. And I don't think any of the rest of the crew did either. He was a very low-key individual. He was slow, methodical, very meticulous in everything he did. He'd get in the cockpit, he would take his handkerchief and dust off the instruments, if you can imagine.
Yeah, we have some pilots who still do that to this day.
He would check everything in the cockpit, and then he would make sure that the crease in his trousers was exactly in the middle, like so, and he was ready to go.
Likeable?
Very nice, very good, very likable.
Was he seen to be fair?
Extremely fair, and never had any complaints. He was always interested in all of his crew and what they were doing and so on.
Cat Musick was on a first-name basis with the crew members, and he wasn't a stickler.
Well, he called me Harry. He was considerate, extremely considerate. Everything he did, his relations with you were very considerate.
Okay, now, when you got back, you were all celebrities now. All 6 of you.
Yeah.
And
No doubt about that. All they do is read the newspapers.
and you've been following. Did he call you from Honolulu?
Are you kidding?
Oh.
$150 a month.
$150 a month?
Yeah.
My God.
I guess I could.
Holy
Not very often.
smokes. And you make him pay for that.
When you arrived back, you were all really celebrities. You really were. You were all the front pages of all the newspapers, and you must have started a scrapbook. Come on, Lucille, you must have.
Yeah, well,
She was
I'm
never.
not a scrapbook
She's not
girl.
that kind of
I
person.
cut out a bunch
We
of stuff.
still have all kinds of clippings.
I had paper frame
Pictures and whatnot.
all that stuff. And I bought a big old book. And even I remember I bought blue paper to put in.
Yeah.
Because that was kind of American colors. I thought that was great. And it's still just about the way I bought the thing.
Well, now
I guess
Newton
that-
had a scrapbook. He had a complete scrapbook. He had big pictures of the Sikorsky around in Diamond Head that had been colored. All you guys had autographed it. I've seen his scrapbook one.
Yeah, well, I had a lot of pictures too, and
He probably had a good
but
wife.
Joe probably, maybe Fred did a lot of it. I don't know, but I never did have time to do it.
I
And
never cared that.
and Lucille is not bent that way, and
Well, of course, once the flight was completed, you had all new ideas now about just exactly how that. And of course, you first thing you did was put an extra fuel tank, and you were ready to. Guess as soon as Midway gave the OK signal and they were ready for you, start out again.
the flights came at 2-month intervals. Midway in June, Wake in August, Guam in October.
Now, which one was the first one with the Martin?
That was Manila. That was the fifth one, yeah, fifth leg.
Okay, and you made, so then in June, you again, same crew, no changes, made the Honolulu and then the Midway.
Alameda, Honolulu, Midway.
Alameda, Honolulu, Midway.
And return.
How was this flight?
Routine.
Did you solve any of your pumping problems with the fuel, or was that a forever thing?
No, it was a forever thing, but it makes it sound like we did most of it by hand. We really didn't. We got a lot of help from that wind-driven pump, but we did a lot by hand, too.
Did all crew members bend a hand, or was that up to Mr. Wright and Mr.
I don't really remember Captain Musick pumping any, but very likely he did some. His offie said, "Let me have a hand on that thing," relieve somebody for a few turns.
Was it a wobble pump or a rotary?
Well, let's see. It seems to me it was
rotary.
Cranking, rotary.
Most fuel pumps were.
Yeah.
Harry was the only crew member of the 4 survey flights that was not on the Martin M130 China Clipper when it made history on November 22, 1935. Harry would be promoted to chief navigator on the second commercial flight to cross the Pacific a couple weeks later in December 1935. Let's take a listen to him and his wife talk about this time.
I'm tired of having you underfoot. You're on your own. Or, of course, it was all planned because they knew they were going to have 2 Martins right behind you, one behind the other. And they wouldn't get back in time for the second one to depart. So you were going to be navigation officer on the second Clipper flight. Second Martin flight.
Philippine Clipper,
yeah. The Philippine Clipper. Now it's November. And November, the first flight goes to Manila. And you're feeling kind of bad because it's taken off and you're not on board.
Don't even remember. Do you remember my feeling bad about it, honey? I don't.
No, I remember we went down for the big ceremony.
Yeah, we were down there, but I don't remember feeling bad. No. I don't know. I don't think it really. We thought of it as this is a.
You didn't realize the history.
Piece of history and so on. No, don't realize that I don't think we really thought about it. Because I don't remember that I felt bad about getting taken. But I had to do it because we had another flight to operate, and who else could do it? That's the reason I was taken off.
Well, all right. Now you're going to go. You're going to go on your first flight alone, which you feel a little apprehensive about it. You must.
No, I didn't. Don't remember.
don't know her.
You
Don't remember.
You felt you knew what
I
you
knew
were doing.
I'd done it, and I know I could. I'd done it, and I know I could do it. That's
Who
all.
was the captain you went with?
That was Tilton, Jack Tilton.
Then you took the second flight, which was right behind the first flight into Manila, and you were a navigation officer.
All right.
But up until that point in time, you'd never been on the Martin, and this was your first trip alone. But you had every confidence. Your training was good, and your knowledge was good, and you had no qualms about it.
No, that's right. It's like when you make your first.
Will you verify that, Lucia?
Yeah, because I was too dumb to be terribly worried. Showdown did a fabulous thing. I know, smartest thing later, looking back on it. The night they went, the first flight to Honolulu, he invited all the wives that wanted to come down to the base to spend the night. And he would come out, or he'd send someone out and give us a report on this thing. So you didn't have a bunch of wives calling in, friends.
He was the operations
The
manager.
entire night down there.
Who was the man? What was his name?
Dutch Schildauer. Schildauer. He was the operations manager of the Pacific Division.
Okay.
Later, the operations manager of the Landing Division when it first started. That's his name.
Yeah, that was good thinking on his part, because you were
It
all.
it was smart. It really was.
Did you know that was happening?
Well, I didn't know it before. Oh, maybe I knew you were going to do it.
Back.
Maybe didn't know it until I came back, but anyway.
Now let's hear Harry and his wife Lucille discuss Fred Noonan, the rumors about his drinking, and his departure from Pan Am. The other female voice you hear is Eldon's wife, Marie.
Well, navigation. That's the reason I was the first one to check out in navigation, the only one besides Fred Noonan, because I already knew navigation. And it was all celestial, you see, that we're talking about now. Mm-hmm. And, of course, naturally, all navigation combined with directly.
But he must have been about 15 years older than you then.
That's right. At that rate.
So he must have been just about 40 at that point in time. Yeah, and he must have seemed like a fairly elderly gentleman to you.
Yeah, middle age.
You're kind. Well, what was Noonan? What did he look like?
He was tall, slender, very slender.
Ichabod Crane.
Yeah, very slender, yeah.
Not very good looking. Wonderful dancer. Smooth with the ladies.
Yeah. Always ready for a party.
According to everything they knew, Noonan left voluntarily. And they were all surprised when he left. Is that correct?
Well, I suppose we were, yeah, but we knew we wanted to do that.
Well, then in all of, and it was a small group, and everybody knew everybody and everything, and all the time that you crews were flying out there, it never came to be knowledge that Fred had been drinking while flying on duty.
Never did, well, all the time I flew with it.
Or that he was reprimanded or going to be fired for drinking, and that as far as you people had all known, he had left Pan Am to go about his own business.
And we were close enough to him, with him on all these flights and all that. We were bound to have known anything off color.
Now, did everybody seem to get along pretty well on your crew?
Oh, yeah. We never had any trouble of any kind with the crew.
Where did the rumors come around then about Noonan being a drinker?
Well, I mean, everybody knew that he liked to drink, but he was always there. Duty time came along, and the skipper never had any complaint about him. Of course, he kept his eye on him pretty closely when we were ashore overnight and so on. I mean, not that he restricted him in any way, but he wanted to know where he was all the time so he wouldn't get in any trouble.
In all these 4 flights that you made, spending up to 2 weeks at a time with Noonan, did you ever know him to not be ready for the flight when the time comes to
No.
be ready for the flight?
No. He almost missed one in Acapulco. Musick's ordinary greeting to any of us when he saw us the first time in the morning, he said, "Has anybody seen Fred?" He's always looking, keep his eye on Fred, see? And so as I said, Vic and I stayed aboard the barge and fueled the airplane, and the rest of the crew went ashore, Acapulco. And so we, as I said, it started to try to get some sleep, and the crew came aboard. Well, Fred came aboard, looked like a drowned rat. And the story went that Musick had greeted the rest of the crew as usual. Has anybody seen Fred? Well, nobody had seen Fred. And they waited around as long as the hotel, as long as they could. And finally had to leave to go down to the dock. And they got down to the dock and were boarding the boat. And a taxi came racing up, and Fred stepped out of the taxi and walked over and promptly stepped off the dock into the water.
I heard that story about him.
And he said that the shadow of the dock in the water looked like the boat. And well, Fred had been out, and he was not too sharp. I mean, he could have navigated the ship and just followed the coast, DR up the coast. But
He'd been out on the town.
I navigated that leg. He'd been out on the town, yeah. But he made and he could have done it himself. I mean,
April 1935. That was the original S-42 ferry flight to
That's
San
right.
Diego.
That's what I'm talking about. Yeah. So I asked if he ever missed a flight. I said that's the nearest he came that I ever knew of. But as far as we knew, he left voluntarily, and
Fred left Pan American all of a sudden for some reason or other, and it had been rumored that it was for drinking.
well, no, that could have been, But these things can take place in people around who don't know anything about it. Particularly if they want to keep it quiet.
This last clip is of Harry talking about seeing Fred Noonan in March 1937 for the last time, after Earhart ground-looped the heavily loaded Electra on takeoff from Luke Field on Ford Island, right in the heart of Pearl Harbor, collapsing the landing gear and sending the plane skidding across the runway in a shower of sparks, ending her first round-the-world attempt before it ever reached the Pacific.
But the night that we flew from Alameda to Honolulu was the same night that Fred and Amelia left Oakland Airport and flew to Honolulu, Pearl Harbor. And because they passed us.
Okay, that picture that you have of this Clipper and Amelia's airplane.
They took a picture of you out of the cockpit window.
Oh, well, I know that they passed us all right around sunset, or just before sunset.
Yeah.
And they were a couple of thousand feet or so below us, but practically right on the track. I remember they walked a little to the right, and as I say, a little below us. And they arrived naturally before we did, quite a bit faster. And so then I saw Fred in Honolulu there at the Alexander Young. The next day, they took off from Ford Island, Pearl Harbor, and cracked up on the takeoff. I don't remember exactly what happened, but washout the airplane. Neither one of them was injured. And back to the hotel, I said, "Well, Fred, have you had enough?" He said, "No, we're going back to Miami, and we're going to get another airplane and start out again, eastbound this time." Well, that's the last time I ever saw Fred, of course.
I want you to take a moment before we continue and reflect. What we just heard is not something you find every day. Harry Canaday did not just know Fred Noonan and Musick as names in a logbook. He flew with them. He sat beside them on flights that had never been attempted before, to islands that barely appeared on a chart, in aircraft stripped down to their bones and filled with fuel. He was part of it. And in 1985, at age 76, he still carried all of it with him. That is what a primary source sounds like. That is why this work matters. Now on to our interview with Laurie Gwen Shapiro. Laurie Gwen Shapiro is a best-selling author, journalist, documentary filmmaker, and adjunct professor in the graduate journalism program at NYU's Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. A member of the Explorers Club, her writing has appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and The New York Times, work that has earned her the Damned History Award and a gold medal from the Silurians Press Club, one of the oldest and most prestigious journalism organizations in the country. She has spent her career finding the stories history almost forgot. Her previous book, The Stowaway, told the remarkable true story of a scrappy teenager from New York's Lower East Side who hid aboard a ship bound for Antarctica during the Jazz Age. Her newest book, The Aviator and the Showman, Amelia Earhart, George Putnam, and the Marriage That Made an American Icon, published by Viking in 2025, is a New York Times editor's choice. Laurie, welcome to the Pan Am podcast.
Thank you for having me on. I'm a bit of a known Pan Am geek myself. So.
Well, there you go. We're going to be talking about lots of aviation stuff. Amelia Earhart, Dorothy and George Putnam, and Juan Trippe, and a whole bunch of other people.
A lot of juicy stuff.
Why did you decide to write a book about Amelia Earhart?
I actually came to Amelia Earhart via George Putnam, believe it or not, her husband. The name of my book is The Aviator and the Showman, and the Aviator is obviously Amelia Earhart, but the Showman is a man who was her manager and her lover while he was married, and then her husband. And he was also very prominent at the end of the Jazz Age as a publisher. He wasn't the head of Putnam Books. He was the nephew of the head of Putnam Books. There's a lot of George Putnams in the Putnam family. So this is George Palmer Putnam. The head of Putnam Books was George Haven Putnam. But well, that's about a digression. What's interesting, though, is that he really wanted to stand out. There was a game of secession, so to speak. There were 5 nephews trying to become the next head of Putnam Books. And George Palmer Putnam started to make a name with pilots and with adventurers. He was the vice president of the Explorers Club in New York, so he had proximity to explorers. He even led a couple of expeditions to up his credibility, but he had most tremendous success in 1927 when he beat out everybody else to get to Charles Lindbergh, and he published a book called We, which was one of the great sellers of the Jazz Age. Now, We has quotations around it, and it was what Charles Lindbergh called the Spirit in St. Louis and himself together. They were we. He also was involved with silent films that had to do with aviation, a movie called Wings that starred Clara Bow, who was the It girl. So in 1928, when Amelia Earhart comes on the scene, he's also Richard Byrd's publisher, who was not a pilot, but he was a navigator, and he led expeditions to the North Pole and to the South Pole that year. And what was left to promote was really not a man going across the Atlantic because he was in the business of books. What was left to promote was a woman. And I was very aware of Richard Byrd because my last book was called The Stowaway, and I even went to Antarctica to research it. And so my specialty of time was 1928 to 1932. And I knew that on the Byrd expedition, he signed up a contest to get a Boy Scout to go to Antarctica. And having gone to Antarctica, I knew how dangerous that was. And I had a moment when I was talking to my book agent who was wondering what I might be doing next. And I said, I just wonder, I mean, it was so dangerous to go to the area of the Antarctic, and he sent a kid to go there. Would he have been involved with Amelia Earhart's death in any way? Could that possibly be because there was danger afoot? And that was really the beginning. And I will tell you also that, like many people who grew up in America, my hero as a child was Amelia Earhart, and I had a Scholastic book that I got it out of those Scholastic Book Fair. My mom's hero was Amelia Earhart, and even my father really greatly admired her. But I don't think that any of the details I started to learn were in that Scholastic book. To begin with, that by a few weeks after Amelia Earhart got back from her first flight as a passenger across the Atlantic, that's how she first became famous, not as a pilot, she was having an affair with a married man. And I just thought, that's not in my Scholastic book. And I just thought, this is the way to begin research. And I want to say at the very beginning of this podcast is that what I'm talking about is an Amelia Earhart book for adults. This is not the book that you give your 8-year-old kid, but I really wanted to know the truth. And that's, I'm a journalist. I write for the New York Times. My book was excerpted in the New Yorker. And I'm also a professor of journalism at NYU in the graduate program. And I teach fact checking. So I'm not a pilot. I did not come in wanting to prove that Amelia Earhart was the best pilot of all time. I came in just purely to find the truth. What is the real story? And that's what journalism is about if you do it right.
So let's talk about the late 1920s. So Pan American World Airways was founded in 1927. We have Charles Lindbergh in the mix. We have Amelia Earhart. Let's talk about all these characters. Laurie, you mentioned George Putnam. Let's talk about Dorothy Putnam. Let's get into it.
Well, let's start by saying that when you think of the jazz age, many people think of the flapper era and Zelda, and this is not what's going on at the end of the 20s. That's sort of passé already. What's being promoted in the media is the end of the flapper. The flapper is dead, the New York Times announced. And what is being promoted is our aviators. The movie Wings that I mentioned before was one of the biggest box office hits. It won the first Academy Award. It was portraying World War I in the 20s. So this is the topic matter. And the aviators who started to have incredible achievements, also planes were getting better. Not as great as they would get later on, but they were still biplanes, but they were getting stronger and they were brave. And anyone could die at any time, and they did often. But anyone that made it across, even a passenger, would get fame overnight. Imagine being a Instagram influencer. If you wanted to get famous, you could be part of a stunt. I mean, people think of flagpole sitting. It's the same kind of thing, but being a passenger could make you famous. You can even get a silent movie deal. And one aviator named Ruth Elder was very beautiful before Amelia Earhart. She tried to go across and she was rescued at sea, and she was a film star the next day. So, but you should know that after Charles Lindbergh went across, Byrd had meant to win this prize called the Orteig Prize, which was offered by a French restaurateur in Greenwich Village to better relations between France and the US after the war. And he offered money, and Charles Lindbergh was watching a newsreel in the 20s, and people were dying attempting. He thought, I can do that. And he did. And Byrd was the favorite, and his plane had a bit of a mechanical breakdown, and Lindbergh took the weather when it was working for him, and he went across, and he became the most famous person in the world. 1/5 of New York City came out to see him when he returned. He saw most of the United States flying on a triumphant tour, and he was also promoting the Putnam book, We. And in 1928, when Amelia Earhart would become famous, again, I hinted at it, she doesn't fly across the Atlantic by herself until 1932, which we know her for, if we don't think about how she died, if we think about her greatest achievement. But she became famous almost like a reality star. She was not intending to go across the Atlantic. Putnam had gotten wind through Byrd of a very wealthy lady named Amy Phipps Guest, who was the Phipps Steel heiress, and she wanted to be a passenger across. A lot of 7 women had tried to go across. 6 of them died. It was dangerous just to be a passenger, and she wanted her life to count. And her children, who were very wealthy, had a bit of an intervention and said, "Ma, you're not going across the Atlantic. You're coming to my wedding. You're not going to die." And they came up with a plan to get a wholesome replacement. And Byrd was telling this to Putnam because Phipps Guest was renting Byrd's plane that he was originally going to take to the South Pole, and he got a different plane. And so he came up with an idea that if we can help find this woman, we'll have an inside track on the first woman to go across. And it was almost like a casting call. And there was a man that he was in cahoots with, a publicist named Hilton Rayleigh, who was in the office that day, but he had an office in New York and he was based in Boston. And he found out about a wholesome social worker who had a pilot's license named Amelia Earhart. And so he visited her in Boston at the job. And much to her shock, he was saying something about her flying across the Atlantic. And that's how Amelia Earhart comes on the scene. She's not burning to do this. And she is picked, and she is a passenger. She doesn't really do anything on the flight. She gets a ticker tape parade for doing nothing on the flight, but sitting on her tush. And she's very ashamed of this because nobody cared about the men going across. They just cared that a woman made it across. And right away, George Putnam, who was in a very dead marriage, he was 10 years older than Amelia Earhart, decided he wanted to have an affair with Amelia Earhart. And that was a struggle at first. But to be fair, Dorothy Binney Putnam was having her own affairs. I mean, it was the jazz age and anything goes. Dorothy has one thing that's very appealing to George Putnam, which is we failed to mention before that she was the Crayola crayon heiress. She's extraordinarily wealthy. And Putnam is a famous name. You know, it goes all the way back to General Putnam. And before that, the Putnams were the people wagging their fingers at the witches at the Salem trial. But it was an old American name, but the Binneys were new money, Crayola crayon, if you remember Smith and Binney. But that's what Putnam wanted. He wanted that money. So that was his first wife, and that was his major goal. Although he very shortly after they got married, the sexual passion just ended right away. She was pretty miserable from the very first months after the marriage began because he got what he wanted. And what he next wanted was Amelia Earhart.
Mm-hmm. So where was Juan Trippe at this time? We are in the late 20s. So we know that Juan Trippe met Charles Lindbergh when he came back from Paris.
Yes, and one of I mean, Amelia Earhart and Charles Lindbergh soon were at the same events. They were even involved with TAT Airlines to go across events together. But she was also very much involved as a passenger on a Pan Am flight to Cuba very early on. Because remember, he becomes famous in 1927 overnight, and she becomes famous in 1928 overnight.
A quick editorial note to our listeners. The Pan American Terminal Laurie just mentioned, where Earhart, Trippe, and Lindbergh stood together on January 9th, 1929, was the 36th Street Airport, also known as Pan American Field, located a few miles north of downtown Miami. This was Pan Am's first proper international terminal, and in fact, the first U.S. port of entry for international air travel built on the American mainland. The famous Dinner Key terminal that most people associate with Pan Am's golden age of flying boats came later. Pan Am began seaplane operations at Dinner Key in December 1930, and the iconic Art Deco terminal building opened in 1934. In 1954, the building became Miami City Hall, which it remains today. It was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1975. And I'm pleased to share with you an update that was announced after our interview was recorded. On March 12, 2026, the Pan American Airways Historic District at the original 36th Street site was also listed on the National Register of Historic Places, which is the official record of the United States of America. Florida's Secretary of State announced the listing, noting that the district represents Florida's leadership role in the history of aviation and innovation in the industry. The airport, where Earhart, Trippe, and Lindbergh stood together in January 1929, is now officially recognized as part of the American Historic Record. When Earhart chose Miami as her departure point for her final round-the-world attempt in 1937, it was Dinner Key, where Pan Am's mechanics spent that week going over her Lockheed Electra. That was 8 years after that first meeting on the 36th Street tarmac, and the Pan Am connection to Earhart's story was still strong. Now back to our interview. So, Laurie, Amelia Earhart was at this grand opening party of this new terminal. She was on the first flight out of this new terminal to Havana in January of 1929 as Juan Trippe's guest, right?
Yes, and she was not flying the plane. She was promotional value. She was not a good pilot in 19. She would get a little bit better, but she was being promoted above her level. In 1929, George would fake that she had the fourth transport license for a pilot, which if many pilots might be listening to this, they know that's really for the top pilots, but it wasn't true. She would not get it for another 18 months. She was doing secret lessons to try to catch up to the way she was being promoted. What her biggest use was for lectures. She would make a lot of money going around the country giving lectures, and also would do things like christenings. It was during the Prohibition, so technically you're not allowed to throw a champagne bottle again, big grapes juice. But she was very, very kind. I want to say that very upfront. She was a phenomenal feminist. She was someone that everyone really adored. I mean, I've been through hundreds of hours of archives and thousands of, audio archives. And I mean, years. This took 5 years to write, incredible amount of archival research. I never really saw a bad word about Amelia Earhart. I mean, George had his designs on Amelia right away. One of the witnesses to this is Hilton Rayleigh, whose archives off the record conversations about everything happening in 28 and 29. And eventually, what happens is that Amelia, a lot of what we know about Amelia Earhart is not true. There's a lot of wonderful things about Amelia Earhart. Again, she's the first president of the 99. She's a tremendous organizer, a feminist, and a big booster of aviation. And Lindbergh is not the most likable person in the world. And Amelia Earhart, her real use in the late 20s is to boost aviation, especially after the stock market crash. Aviation at that time, the economy of it was based in New York City. Her offices were in Midtown. As she was always complaining that she was always a vice president of aviation companies, but she was really the person that was supposed to do PR. People loved Amelia Earhart. People didn't love Lindbergh. They were in awe of him, but when they met him, they didn't like him so much. Among the many tapes that I listened to, that anyone who's listening to this can listen to, the Amelia Earhart Project at the Smithsonian, which are 200 hours of tapes taken in the 70s that no biographer had listened to besides me until I got them on day one.
Wow.
And that's why I raced down to Virginia to listen to them. But they're actually online. Anyone can listen to them from their home. But Dorothy Binney Putnam had been recorded by an aviation investigator, a pilot named Elgin Long. He also recorded George Putnam's two other wives. There were four altogether. He also recorded Amelia's stepchildren, and people don't think of Amelia Earhart as a mother. She was very close to George Putnam, the younger. These tapes are from the 70s, and they can't say a bad word about their stepmother. I mean, one of the things that is in Dorothy's diaries, is that George was a very vindictive person and was going through her journals. She files a Reno divorce in September of 29. Remember, she's got the money. She's caught Amelia Earhart in a sexual affair with George Putnam. Again, she's having her own affair with another man named George, who's 10 years younger than her. But she wants out of this marriage. She has a new lover and she files, and George Putnam is okay with it. But what happens in October of 1929? There's a stock market crash. And suddenly he's having second thoughts about having his wealthy wife. I mean, people are still going to use crayons. And he tries to woo Dorothy back. He's also, then she's not having it. He tries to blackmail her. So my belief, and I can't prove it, is one of the reasons why the house that Dorothy, Binney, and George Putnam have in Rye, New York, which I've been inside for hours. It's a big mansion. Dorothy will move to Florida and start over, but she is leaving the house that her money paid for with George. And Amelia Earhart eventually will get married to George Putnam and move into this mansion of her former friend and inherit her staff, including chauffeurs and butlers in her garden. I mean, this is again, I don't know if this is my refrain, but this is not an Amelia Earhart book for your 8-year-old daughter.
It's like a reality TV show today.
Oh, it's a soap opera for sure. But you have to understand that the world changes and the story of Amelia Earhart and George Putnam change, and also for Lindbergh and also for Pan Am, also for everyone with the stock market crash, because the aviation industry was booming. At that time, people were just millionaires overnight in aviation, and then whole industries and companies just were bankrupt overnight. And Amelia Earhart became very useful because she became an ambassador for the air. And one of the things that she would do, not as a pilot, but she would go with planes and take women up in the air because people didn't want to spend their money. And she would say, look, you would get an advantage by flying. And she would only have women going up in the air with her. And she would walk around while someone else was flying and say, are you enjoying it? And they would land, and maybe they would let their husbands go on their next flight. And she would say, your husbands can get to the job quicker. This is better than driving. And so in 1932, Amelia Earhart will go across the Atlantic by herself. It was supposed to be promoted by her new husband, George, who was Dorothy's ex-husband, if we're keeping track. And she has a red Vega, which is now hanging in the Smithsonian. After 7 years, it's been put back. Brand new, reopened early aviation hall, which is fantastic. I visited, I wrote about it for Smithsonian Magazine this summer. And her plane is right next to the Spirit of St. Louis. These are the real planes. These are not reproductions. And you can see how tiny this plane is. The plane that she disappeared in is obviously not in the Smithsonian. I know that people can figure that out, but just in case you're wondering, because it's gone. But there is a twin to that plane that is in Kansas at the Amelia Earhart Hangar Museum in Atchison, Kansas, where Amelia was born. And it is the only other Lockheed 10E in existence. And you can really get a sense of what the size of the plane is and how much more sophisticated it was from 1932 to 1937. If we think about technology now, like we can't even keep up. It was the same way back then. And you had to keep your flying skills up. And that's one thing that Amelia Earhart was not doing, because she had made $1 million in promotions and sponsorships in 1928 and she was a millionaire by the time of the stock market crash. She would lose all her money. Putnam, who was up to no good all the time, like faking that Putnam Books was going to be blown up by fascists. Later on, he would fake his own kidnapping and write the ransom letters. This is not normal behavior, by the way. His uncle was not loving this, as you can imagine. And when the will was read, he was not he did not win the game of secession. He was pushed out of his family firm and he joined a very small firm. And one of the few people that would go with him was Amelia Earhart because she was being loyal. And this is where you start to see how important this new relationship becomes. Amelia Earhart wants to fly, but flying costs money. Putnam is taking 10% of everything that she makes, even when they're married. That's Amelia's choice, by the way. But they need each other. So people can say, did George exploit Amelia? But Amelia was very much in a relationship with a man that she knew was often making up stories and even making up her own flying experience. She did not have hundreds of hours of flight, which was how she was being promoted. But they come up upon a way to keep things afloat. And remember, they're house rich, cash poor. They have that house, but they don't have any money. And she goes on the lecture circuit and she's charging pretty good money to do a lecture. And to keep in the news, you have to do a stunt and then she would lecture on it. Now, a lot of women pilots at this time, like Louise Thaden, like Eleanor Smith, even Laura Ingalls, not Laura Ingalls Wilder, by the way, a different Laura Ingalls. These are all phenomenal women pilots, much better pilots than Amelia Earhart, but they are not married to George Putnam. They are not being promoted as the queen of aviation. They're not on the lecture circuit. And Amelia Earhart is crisscrossing the country, but she's not getting hours in flight time, which you need to be a really good pilot.
We're going to take a quick break and listen to a 1935 Universal newsreel featuring the actual voice of Amelia Earhart.
Roaring into the Oakland airport, she brings to a triumphant finish her 2,400-mile hop from Hawaii after 18 hours in the air. 10,000 cheer the end of the epical flight as the Lady Lindy slides into a perfect landing with 2 records. The first woman to fly the Pacific and the first person to fly it solo. Roses to Amelia and the plaudits of the world to a veteran of flights that have shown the way for aviation's progress. It's her most brilliant chapter in a 16-year aviation career. How does it feel to fly both oceans, Miss Earhart?
Well, it was very interesting to me to fly in southern waters rather than in the north. On the Atlantic flight, I had ice conditions and general storm. On this flight, really no bad weather at all except a few little rain squalls. I saw the moon and stars most of the night. Of course, in both flights, I was very glad to see land.
Welcome back to our interview with Laurie Gwen Shapiro, author of the award-winning book, The Aviator and the Showman. What was the relationship between Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart? Did they get along? Were they friends?
She wasn't so crazy about him, if you want to know the truth. She was pretty good friends with his wife, Anne Morrow Lindbergh. I understand this. I actually just got an early look at a book about the marriage of Anne and Charles. Now, they have very complicated history. Let's not let that get erased because it's very important we talk about truth. We have to make sure that our heroes are fully described. I mean, Charles Lindbergh was an incredible pilot. He had other children that were hidden. He had other wives in Europe. And his biographer missed this. So things come out after things can come out after my biography comes out. And a good journalist says, hey, I missed it. Scott Berg, who won the Pulitzer Prize in 1989 for his book on Charles Lindbergh, acknowledges he missed that he had 3 other wives. So the thing that I wanted to tell you, though, is that Anne Morrow was very close to Amelia. When they put in the new airline, TAT, which is, I believe, the summer of 1929. Amelia takes one of the flights going towards Los Angeles. This is a cross-country flight. It also involves train travel. This is not our kind of...
And one of the stops is in Columbus, Ohio.
Right, exactly.
To open up the new airport terminal.
Yeah, this is the fastest way across, but you also had to take a few trains to get there. But that's when Anne and Amelia really meet. Dorothy Binney Putnam is involved, by the way, on that flight. Yeah, it's like as I said, it's a soap opera. She's doesn't want to miss out, you know. um, and Charles Lindbergh makes fun of Amelia Earhart of the amount of luggage that she's taking on this trip. But I think what's really interesting is that she sees Lindbergh up close and often up close and doesn't particularly like him. And Anne Morrow was a terrific writer, but she was pretty close to Amelia Earhart. And one scene that I have in the Aviator and the Showman is when they're over. Charles Lindbergh is invited over to Rye, and somebody is secretly taking notes and sells it to the paper. And Charles Lindbergh is very upset at Amelia and George, and she writes a note to Anne that this we didn't know this was happening. It was just someone who decided they were going to get a scoop. Because if you could get a scoop on Charles Lindbergh, and remember, Charles Lindbergh is in the news in the 1930s for another reason. His son was kidnapped. And I always felt that the attention that he got on that, George must have taken mental notes because he fakes his own kidnapping right after Amelia Earhart disappears. And I think, what did the Lindberghs think of that? Because they weren't that close to George. Charles Lindbergh didn't like the book. He didn't like the ghostwritten version that he was given. He rewrote it himself. It wasn't a great rewrite, but it sold well. Later on, perhaps with Anne's help, he would rewrite the story of crossing the Atlantic, A Spirit of St. Louis, that was made into a movie with, of all people, Jimmy Stewart, not looking that young as Charles Lindbergh. But he won the Pulitzer Prize for his retelling. He just felt that George Putnam was in the business of sausage, which he was. You have to give some credit to Putnam for one thing. He was a master at new innovations like an instant book, like using ghostwriters. Somebody is in the news, nobody cares in a few months. So let's get a book out quick. And that is how Amelia and George got into an affair, because he embedded her in Rye. Dorothy Binney Putnam was living there, living together. And that's where the affair really, really begins. And she's embedded with ghostwriters. She's not writing her own book. If you believe that, I have a bridge to sell you in New York. She's embedded with a man named Fitzhugh Green. And a little tidbit, this is not in my book. This is just a special for the podcast. Amelia Earhart's ghostwriter, Fitzhugh Green, is the grandfather of New York Times writer Penelope Green.
Interesting.
I found that out after my book came out. She confirmed it. So I had seen records, but that it was confirmed by her. And so it's really interesting. But you know what? He also does things like puts a record on the back of a book of, like, when Amelia crosses the Atlantic in 32, there's a little record that's a very collectible item. If any aviation book collectors listening, try with the record at the back. I have an Amelia Earhart book. I'm not going to give you my address. Signed. And I did a down payment plan on it over 4 years, and I own it, and it's worth a few $1,000s.
Oh, wow.
And
That's
that's
awesome.
just, it doesn't even have the cover on it, and it's just her signature alone. Imagine what a signed copy of her book with the record intact would be.
And where's Juan and Betty Trippe in all of this? Early 1930s.
Well, they are. I think they're much more. I'm gonna guess that they're much more connected to Lindbergh. Pan Am. We're gonna get to Fred Noonan, I hope.
Yes.
Pan Am. I mean, that's a big part of the Pan Am connection to Amelia Earhart. But Pan Am is developing something called the flying ships?
The flying boats.
The flying boats. That's it. And these have pontoons, I believe, on it, so that they can fly.
The Sikorsky's.
Right? Because it flies safely over. That's why they're crossing. I mean, that first trip is to Cuba, where they're crossing water. And later on, they start to basically, envision the world as a market and go across oceans and go across the Atlantic Ocean and go across the Pacific Ocean. And there are very, very brave aviators that are involved with this expansion, right? And one of them is a celestial navigator named Fred Noonan, who was, and if I'm assuming that everyone listening to this podcast knows what a celestial navigator is, but for anyone who doesn't, I'm going to tell you they use the skies to navigate. And Fred Noonan was really good at this. He was considered at Pan Am their top navigator. He is a man that will become very synonymous with Amelia Earhart's name as we continue with the story.
So early 1930s, Noonan is working for Pan Am, and Pan Am is expanding all over the globe with the flying boats. Amelia Earhart and George Putnam are living in a mansion, but they're struggling for cash.
Well, at this point, the marriage is, like I'm in a long-term marriage, and there's good years and there are bad years. That's what marriage looks like. So is this a real marriage? Yes. Are they having sexual relations? Yes. That's on tape from his colleagues. It's not like I'm just guessing.
What kind of tapes are these?
All off record, but now that the gentleman has died, they've been made available through the Smithsonian Institute. So there's really some like people thinking that their words are not going to be heard. And here I am listening in 2025, and they were taped in 1971. But I think what's really amazing to me is people don't realize. I mean, I had older parents. My father was born in 1920, which is pretty. He lived to 100. He had an older. My mother was his second wife, and he could remember pretty far back. The Great Depression got worse and worse and worse, and we have really forgotten that. And celebrities were hit too. Aviation contracts were drying up. And in 1935, it got worse. In 1936, it got worse. It got so bad that George Putnam, who was the vice president of Explorers Club, I've seen the archives at the Explorers Club. I'm a new member of the Explorers Club, and he had to resign. He had no money. So they have very little money to go. And what they're looking for is a final stunt. Amelia Earhart has gotten a new gig. She's not quite a professor, but she's hired as a consultant to Purdue University, where she is coming in for 6 weeks at a time to work with women, young girls, and talk about aviation, about becoming mechanics, about, again, she's this tremendous feminist, and they love her. I mean, if you go to Purdue University, where much of the archives are involving Amelia Earhart, there's statues of Amelia Earhart everywhere. And she has developed some relations there. And George Putnam at a party comes up with the idea of them buying her a plane and that she will be able to keep the plane. And this is an Electra 10E, which is the plane that she will take on her famous trip around the world. But what you need to know is that there are two attempts at this around the world trip. It is not a trip to push women forward like her 1932 trip, where she wanted to prove that yes, she wasn't a sack of potatoes. She didn't have to sit on her tush. She could actually fly across. She didn't fly to Paris where she was supposed to. She went to Outfield in Derry, Ireland, but she was the second person across. Let's not be so nitpicky, right? But the thing that you need to know is that the first person that was hired as a navigator was a man named Harry Manning, who was a sea captain on the SS Roosevelt, where Amelia Earhart met him in 1928 when she was coming back as a passenger right before her ticker tape parade. He was very handsome, and he was a bit of a womanizer, and she had a shipboard romance with him. That's in my book. And one of my sources on that is Harry Manning's second wife. So I'm not just making this up either. Harry Manning and Amelia had a friendship, and she always promised him if she ever did a flight around the world that she would use his navigational skills. So he was a sea captain, but he was a really good navigator. And her friends, including the pilot Jackie Cochran, who would later help develop the WASP program in the United States, felt that Manning should not be her navigator because he was not someone who was used to the air, and she wanted a test for him. And they gave him a test, and There's some discretion. I guess like fight between Manning's version and Amelia Earhart's friend's version of whether or not he passed his test. But basically, they wanted to bring on a second navigator just to be sure. And that man was a man named Fred Noonan. Now, Fred Noonan in the archives, and this is again on the tapes and in letters, came cheap because he was a tremendous navigator, but he had a lot of problems with alcoholism. And he was fired from Pan Am for alcoholism.
Mhm.
And is a lot of paperwork and audio tapes to that effect, including his colleagues at Pan Am. For those who want to go down the rabbit hole, you can always email me at my website and find my website at LaurieGwenShapiro.com. I'll get you the tape number. But they start talking about how he was just this incredible navigator, but very talented. But that's what Putnam wanted, to just get him on there. And he was announced on St. Patrick's Day of 1937. The trip that they were doing was a trip around the equator. This is not one flight, but a series of flights. It's a gimmick. A Wiley Post had already gone around the world by himself. So this was a leisurely flight near the equator. They mapped out a way to go from leaving from California, going to Hawaii, going to this tiny island that nobody thought she should go to, called Howland Island, and then on to New Guinea. That was the original plan in that direction. What happens is that she's not really getting her hours on this Electra. She has a flight coach named Paul Mance, who doesn't think she's really that ready. But Putnam is getting book deals. He's getting a film deal there's NBC deals. There's even Quaker Oats has a contract. If she makes this flight, she's going to get the equivalent of about, millions of dollars in today's money. But what happens is Paul Mance secretly flies her from California to Hawaii one last time just to show her, how to be on, piloting. And then she's about to take off in Hawaii, and she's not in the air. Her plane spins out, and what happens is called ground looping, and the whole plane collapses on its belly, and it's complete. If you see photos of it, it's destroyed. It's about to go into flames, but everybody gets out. Nobody dies, but Manning is disgusted. This is the person who was a navigator. And in lots of records that I have, he wants nothing to do with Amelia Earhart, the pilot, and goes back to the United States line as a sea captain. Junior navigator that was brought on at Jackie Cochran's suggestion, and George Putnam finding out that this guy could come cheaply, was promoted to the full captain. And this was Fred Noonan for a second flight, which was going in the opposite direction. Now, Amelia Earhart wanted to wait and follow the same flight that had been planned for her by a gentleman who knew a lot of these details, and he quit too. And George Putnam again is looking at that publishing deadline. If you around Christmas is when all the big books are. If she had to do this flight so the book could be written and they could hit the book contract. And my source on this, that they wanted to flip the flight, is Amelia Earhart's friend and rival, Louise Thaden, who won the Women's Air Derby in 1929. She's on the Amelia Earhart tapes. Everybody write that down again, Smithsonian. She's talking off the record about how Amelia and George were fighting, that she didn't want to go in that direction, but she felt very loyal to him. The problem with this is that Howland Island, which is the size of Central Park in the middle of the Pacific, is a very dangerous place to stop and refuel. It could look like clouds from the sky if you miss it. There's only a certain amount of fuel that they could take from Lae, New Guinea, which was a gold mining town in New Guinea. It wasn't an indigenous town. It was Australian run. That's why they had a strip there. If you miss it, you're out of fuel. You're out of luck. And people like Louise Thaden and Jackie Cochran, who were Amelia's pilot friends from the 99s, which still exists, the Women's Pilots Organization. Amelia was the first president, by the way. They are begging her not to do this. Why do you have to do this? You already have a career. You already have a record. You could go to Purdue. You could become a professor. But there's so much money. This particular flight around the world, again, a series of stops, is a money-making endeavor. It's a retirement plan. There's no reason for her to be doing this.
Wow.
Now, what happens is Fred Noonan starts out okay. He is not drinking for a certain period of time until he gets to around Indonesia, and there are people on these tapes drinking with him. And word gets back to Putnam, and they have words and harsh words. Amelia and Fred start to not get along. Amelia also gets very, very sick in Asia. She gets dysentery, and she's a skinny woman to begin with. She drops 10 pounds. I'm going to use the D word, which is diarrhea, extremely vomiting and diarrhea, very sick.
Mhm.
And she carries on. And eventually, when they get to Ley, New Guinea, which is going to be the last place that we see footage, there's video footage of her getting on there. Fred has a full relapse on drinking. There's a small inn, a Australian run inn. I'm married to an Australian man. The Aussies drink. His are surrounded by men who are encouraging him to drink, and several of the people, including the hotel owner, are on tape saying that he was drinking very heavily 2 days before the flight. Now, what is also on the tape is that Amelia Earhart is so distraught. And remember, Amelia does not have Morse code skills. She had 10 words per hour, and Fred Noonan was a navigator. There was a whole team on the Pan Am flights. He wasn't in charge of Morse code and communications. He has less than 10 words a minute. Harry Manning knew Morse code really well, but these two people do not know Morse code. They have left a lot of things behind. They've left behind a trailing antenna. George Putnam is so broke that they couldn't afford to pay any staff. He's now taken over. A PR guy, the PT Barnum of publishing, is making major aviation decisions. Fred Noonan in Miami checked in with Pan Am and left some equipment behind. But even in New Guinea, when they're rushing to go, he leaves smoke bombs under his bed. Now, what happens the day before, this is as far as I can trace, is that Amelia borrows a truck from there's a tiny little hotel in Ley, New Guinea, and the owner, a very old lady, is interviewed in New Guinea by Elgin Long. The reason he can do all these interviews is he's a pilot himself from the Flying Tigers. So he's flying to his interviews, and he's trying to solve, like many people have, the mystery of how Amelia Earhart disappears. And he realizes very quickly on that this is a mismanaged flight, and she's not prepared for this flight. But one of the things that he finds out is that Amelia borrows a truck the day before she leaves because she wants to put eyeballs on Fred to make sure he's not drinking. And on paper, they go to an indigenous village in New Guinea, and I've been to New Guinea. That's one of the reasons I'm in the Explorers Club. I've spent quite a bit of time in New Guinea. And, this is not the same as the Australian town Ley that they're in. And she's taking notes, and it's going to be ghostwritten into a column, maybe for her book later. She would scribble a few notes, and they would wire it, and ghostwriters would start to write. And that was another source of income. A New York Herald Tribune, a syndicated column about her adventures. And remember, at this time, this trip around the world is getting not enough media attention. What is dominating world headlines is the Hindenburg crash. Very soon, Amelia Earhart's missing plane is going to replace the Hindenburg in the newspaper headlines, but they are not getting headlines. So she's trying to get color, but she's basically trying to make sure that he's not drinking. There is also a record that there is a radio operator in New Guinea named Harry Balfour, who works for the gold company. That's why there's planes there. And Amelia is begging him. He obviously has Morse code skills to come on this flight, even though it's packed with fuel. They've gotten rid of everything. And he says no. And one of the reasons he says no is because his boss, who is an Australian man named Eric Chater, says, we're not going to let go of our radio operator. All of our planes would crash. You got to know Morse code. So she knows that she's about to get on that plane at a great risk. And she's sick. Remember, she has dysentery. She's on tapes. People say that she was very upset with Fred Noonan. He was calling her a skinny bitch. Remember, this is not the book for your 8-year-old kid. I'm going to say that. And there's a lot of tension. We do see film of him hopping on the plane. He doesn't look drunk, but remember he had that day in that indigenous village. Who knows what was going on in the plane? We do not know that he was drinking at all, that he snuck anything onto the plane. I only go by the facts. All right. What's amazing to me is that they got very close to Howland Island, right there, because the radio operators from the Itasca, which is the Coast Guard cutter that was part of this whole setup, there was a Coast Guard cutter that was parked right by the island that was supposed to be doing radio communication with her, which of course she's not going to get in full capacity. He is talking to Amelia Earhart. He is the last person to talk to Amelia Earhart. He's on these tapes, and he says she got there. They were right there. He got so close that he opened up his window on the ship to look out to look up and to wave at her. And shortly after that, she's very frantic that she's out of fuel. And he talks about how terrified her voice sounds. Now, I want to say this for anyone listening. The facts, the Coast Guard records, these audio tapes that I was one of the few people to listen to, all support that she ran out of fuel about 12 to 24 miles from near Howland Island, and that the plane is at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, either in one or two pieces. There's a lot of nonsense there about capture stuff, other that she had enough fuel to get to an island 400 miles away, that her plane is in a lagoon. There's all sorts of money to be made on nonsense. And I'm a journalism professor. My only goal here is the truth. There's also money to be made on expeditions. There's a whole business of expeditions, not-for-profits that raise money, and then someone has to take a salary, putting out things like, oh, we found her freckle cream, and then, oh, we didn't find it. It wasn't her freckle cream. Scientists don't put out facts before they found something, and neither do seasoned people who are searching for planes. Now, there is one organization I want to bring everyone's attention to, which is called Nauticus, and they also believe that Amelia Earhart's plane is at the bottom of the ocean. They've recovered quite a few aircraft, and they're working with the radio team to try to recreate the radio frequencies, and they are legit. They don't have a shyster reputation.
Mhm.
I'm not going to name anyone else. But what I will say is that, and this is fascinating to me, I learned a lot about lost aircraft. Fred Noonan and Amelia Earhart were talking to each other by a jerry-rigged fishing pole, bamboo fishing pole. It was very noisy in the Electra, and they were passing notes back and forth. And if anyone is a Titanic fan that's listening, yes, things like buttons will last, and shoes will last, but surprisingly, very deep in the Pacific, and this is one of the deepest parts of the Pacific, paper lasts. You can read the Titanic is in the Atlantic, but you can read papers that are at the bottom of the ocean. Maybe those papers that they were passing exist. Maybe manuals exist. We will know it's her plane, but do I think the plane is still there? Yes, I do. I don't think we have found it. And I want to emphasize to everyone that the Pacific is not the Atlantic. It is incredibly deep. It is incredibly wide. If you search an area, it's like searching a pinprick. But a lot of it has been ruled out, not all of it. And that is also useful information. Where someone is not is also information that a scientist will put into charts, and it eliminates spots. And many planes and ships have been found after one spot was searched, including the Titanic. You eliminate where it's not. And I do think that maybe during my lifetime, maybe during your lifetime, the plane will be recovered. What's interesting is who claims ownership of the plane. Does this plane belong to Purdue University? Maybe that's why Purdue is now getting into the business of saying, oh, we found the plane. I don't think that plane is in a lagoon 400 miles away. And I know people might come for me, but I just go by facts. I also am very much aware of the business of Amelia Earhart. how Amelia Earhart funds a lot of things, including people's salaries when they're searching. They might not find Amelia Earhart, but they just got a salary for the year. So be very wary of anyone who says they found something before there's evidence. Think like a scientist or a journalist. Don't think like a conspiracy theorist.
That's a good point. Very good point.
And what's amazing to me is that, I have people that say, well, Fred Noonan is someone who's on this plane, and we need to also think about his legacy. But one of the things that's really important to me is that I'm drawing up characters that are human. Again, you can be an incredible navigator and also be a really horrifying alcoholic. I mean, it's tragic. These are human beings. Amelia Earhart is I say this in my introduction to the book, she's incredibly brave. When you know how ready, is that a word? Unready? She was her whole flight. You realize she's even braver. I mean, she's basically taking them on one of the most dangerous trips in the world. Her friends are telling her not to do it, but she did this often. When she goes on that 1928 flight as a passenger, the man flying the plane is Wilmer Stoltz. He will die of alcoholism in the air. She's literally throwing bottles of alcohol out the window while he's flying. And George Putnam has put this young woman on that flight, but she's put herself on that flight. She knows Wilmer Stoltz is an alcoholic. Later on, she will take tremendously brave trips across Hawaii and into Mexico, and she will set records, but often she's just a whisker from dying. And it is a sort of a mentality, I think, that occurs when you've beat the odds quite a bit. You start to think that perhaps you think you're invincible, and it will catch up to you. Think about Evel Knievel. Like that mentality is not going to work. You can be pretty lucky, but you can also be very unlucky, and that's it. I think that anyone that was flying at that time, I mean, even Wiley Post, who's one of the great aviators, have a crash, right? We know where his plane is. We know where it landed, so there's not that mystery attached. But the men were crashing all the time. But Amelia Earhart was not the world's best pilot. It's okay to say that, but she does do one thing that's incredible. She is pushing aviation forward. She's almost single-handedly saving the aviation industry at the stock market crash. And when you go up in a plane today as a passenger, you can thank Amelia Earhart sort of normalizing that it's okay to take a plane ride. She's also pushing women forward. One thing we have to also understand is that George Putnam is part of the story too, because history is not clean. I want anyone listening to realize that we don't get rid of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson from our books for having slaves, but they had slaves. I mean, this is what history looks like. Amelia Earhart is not a slave owner. She's a kind, good person who people love. George Putnam is not a nice guy. He is bullying other women pilots, including Eleanor Smith. He and Lady Heath from Ireland. There are women on record. Louise Thaden is one of the great pilots. She talks a lot about this on those tapes that I've mentioned, the Amelia Earhart Project, about how he was bullying Amelia Earhart to go around the world the other way. But what's fascinating to me is that we do not get those women that idolize Amelia Earhart, including my own mother, who wanted to achieve partly because of Amelia Earhart without George Putnam. Some of the people that I interviewed for my book are the women that are involved with the new project where we're going back to the moon, women astronauts. Their idol was Amelia Earhart. Now, Amelia Earhart was going to continue down the path of social work. That's where she was going. So if she wasn't plucked in 1928 in this almost reality show, to fulfill a book deal, we might not know her name. And George Putnam is part of the reason that women are going back to the moon. So I want you to think about history in that way. It's nuanced. We don't have to have our heroes perfect. Fred Noonan can be a great pilot and a bad drinker. He was also a womanizer. I'm just going to get that out there. I kind of edited a lot of that out of my book because the drinking was a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So this is, again, at the height of the Great Depression. And I would say in my book, you have decades as characters as well. You have the prosperity of the Jazz Age, the freewheeling sexuality of the Jazz Age. And then you have the 1930s where people are pretty sober in terms of like getting whatever we have to do to get money. And, George Putnam was a master hustler, and he was able to get a plane for Amelia Earhart, who really found her calling. By the way, she had 31 jobs. She was not that young when she became famous. She was 31. She was lying about her age. She shaved 2 years, but a lot of women did. We didn't do that. Um, but she, the women that were coming up, like Eleanor Smith was an incredible pilot. She was 16 years old. She's on the first woman on the Wheaties box. She was considered the best woman pilot in America in 1930. And
Wow.
that was the person that Putnam went after because he wanted Amelia Earhart to be the queen of aviation. That's one of the reasons why he put out the false story that she had the fourth transport license to try to to cut Eleanor Smith's rise out. And he incredibly bullied her. But the thing is, by 35, everyone is feeling it. I mean, people are, the Binnies in particular were protected because people still, Dorothy Binney Putnam says in her journal that she did lose a bit of money at the stock market, but people were still buying crayons in the Great Depression.
Mm-hmm.
That crayon money but she had some tragic remarriages. And it seems like George Putnam mellowed a bit on his fourth marriage. But one of the things is that, right after Amelia disappears, like literally 6 weeks later, he has a beautiful young stunt woman that he's lapped. That's his girlfriend. But then he figures out that she's not really that wealthy. So he zeroes in, like he did on Dorothy, on another woman named Jean, who is a Beverly Hills banking heiress in her 20s, very beautiful. And he thinks that she has a lot of money, and he has fooled the world that he's a wealthy publisher, and she thinks he has money. And they kind of have a rude awakening on the wedding night. And that's maybe where the faked kidnapping attempt comes to try to get some money raised. I mean, it's a crazy, wacky story. And I encourage everyone to reach out to me if you have questions. I do answer my emails at lauriegwenshapiro.com. You could find the email there.
Let's take a break for a moment and listen to a 1937 newsreel from Pathé Gazette breaking the news of Amelia Earhart's disappearance.
Only a short time ago, Amelia Earhart checked over every detail of her $80,000 flying laboratory in preparation for her round-the-world flight. This was to have been her greatest achievement, a sky dash of 28,000 miles. With her husband, George Palmer Putnam on right, she discussed the hazardous course which had been plotted for her by Fred Noonan, the navigator who embarked with Miss Earhart upon this great flight, a flight which was to have marked her retirement to aeronautical research. Then to a waiting world came news of disaster as the plane failed to reach tiny Howland Island in mid-Pacific. A British freighter, the Coast Guard, and the Navy sped to the search, the battleship Colorado steaming out from Honolulu under forced draft. From California, the aircraft carrier Lexington, with 3,000 men and 72 planes aboard, races into the distant Pacific to join the greatest searching party in the history of aviation.
I want to take a moment to close the loop on the Pan Am story here that brought us to this conversation. Laurie's book is about Amelia Earhart and George Putnam, and that is exactly what she talked about today. But as we heard in the first part of this episode, that story cannot be fully understood without Pan Am. Fred Noonan learned to navigate the Pacific at Pan Am's expense on Pan Am's most important missions alongside Pan Am's finest crews. Juan Trippe personally extended the airline's full cooperation to Earhart's final flight. Pan Am mechanics prepared her aircraft. Pan Am's radio network was on standby. And when the silence came on the morning of July 2nd, 1937, Pan Am's Pacific stations were among those listening. The U.S. Coast Guard's official records of the search effort included a formal Pan American Airways report, a detail that history has largely forgotten. Pan Am was there at the beginning of Earhart's story, at the center of it, and at the end of it. What strikes me most, sitting with all of this, is how small the world actually was at the center of it. Trippe, Earhart, Lindbergh, Musick, Canada, Noonan. These were not distant figures operating in separate orbits. They knew each other. They flew together, planned together, and in some cases staked their lives on each other's judgment. Trippe was not simply building an airline. He was building a global network of routes with a genius of vision that few people in any era have matched, the belief that the entire world could be connected by air on schedule every week. And the people around him were the ones making it real, one crossing at a time over oceans that had never been flown over before. But they were also human, every one of them. Brilliant and flawed in equal measure, ambitious and vulnerable, capable of extraordinary courage and ordinary mistakes. This is not a diminishment of what they achieved. It is what makes their story worth telling honestly, because the truth of who they were is more interesting, more complicated, and more moving than any legend ever could be. Laurie, as we're nearing the end of the episode, what is the most surprising thing that you have uncovered in your research for this book, and what message do you have for our listeners about Amelia Earhart and aviation?
Well, I want to reiterate that Amelia Earhart was a very good person. That's something that I just heard over and over again. I didn't hear the same about George Putnam, but that's why there's a story. What I did learn is that in many ways, Amelia's legacy is that she was the first influencer. We think of influencer culture now, but she did have a platform. And she wanted to use her platform for good. And it was one of the reasons she did the flights. She wasn't always taking the safety precautions that other pilots were taking, but she wanted to keep her name in the news, not just for money, but also to promote feminism and aviation. And she wanted to show that women could do things. And she also wanted women to be able to take the same risks that men take without having people second guess her. Now, think about the very early test pilots for the moon race. Okay, most of them died. Many of them went on these trips knowing that they could die. We don't say, how dare they take those trips. What Amelia Earhart wanted was the same chance to be able to take a venture. She was a stepmother, but she decided not to have kids with George Putnam. That had been discussed. She wanted to be, they did have a mother. Her stepchildren had Dorothy, right? She wanted to be able to take risks. One thing that I really believe about Amelia, who was leaning towards civil rights at the end of her life, she had started out believing in eugenics, unfortunately, like many people did in the 1920s, including people in the Black community themselves. But she was really pushing for civil rights. That's on record in the Eisenhower Library, by the way, Jackie Cochran's archives. She's a little bit annoyed at Amelia Earhart. I'm kind of cheering for her. But what's amazing to me is that I do believe that she believed in women's ability in aviation. And I do believe that if Amelia Earhart had lived, she would have continued to be a mentor to women in aviation. And I believe she would have been very involved with the space program and really championing women astronauts. Unfortunately, Jackie Cochran, although she did push for the WASP program, had sort of the opposite effect on women astronauts in the early days of NASA. She did not think that women should be going up in space. And I can't imagine Amelia Earhart thinking that way. And I think one of the things that I realized is that everyone that gets a platform, and we can now get platforms overnight on Instagram ourselves, we should be using whatever little platform that we have for good. And I have a little platform. I'm not Kim Kardashian, but I got a little thing going here now. And I try to use it for reiterating not to buy into conspiracy nonsense, not to buy into easy facts. People did not find the plane. If you see that she's eaten by coconut crabs, that should sound like a little bell, like a journalist's brain going, let me check that out. There's a saying in journalism, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. And the only other thing that I learned that I really want to share with, because this is an aviation podcast, is one of the great stops. I've done over 30 cities on tour. I'm taking a break. The book came out in July. I'm going out again in March to Tucson and to many other cities around the country. I did go to the Oshkosh fly-in, the EAA event with 700,000 pilots, which is like Disneyland for aviation. It was extraordinary. I got to speak to a full crowd about Amelia Earhart. But one of the things that the pilots taught me, and again, I'm not a pilot, is that many aviators die from something they call get-home-itis. That is, the flight's almost over. Remember, Amelia's sick. She's fighting with Noonan, who had been drunk. George Putnam is sending telegrams. If you get here by July 4th, we'll get you on the radio. And she's trying to get Harry Balfour to come on the plane, and he said no. And they just get on that plane. It's like, let's get it over. Did Amelia Earhart perhaps die from get-over-itis? That's what I asked listeners as well.
Interesting. Yeah, very interesting. Well, Laurie, thank you very much for joining us. This has been an incredible conversation.
That's a nice compliment. Thank you. I am so honored to be on this podcast. And again, I was telling you at the very beginning before we started taping that when I was in college and I was kind of dressed in mod clothing, of course, touting, instead of my knapsack in college, I was carrying around a Pan Am bag because I had seen the Beatles photos and I just wanted to be on Carnaby Street. But I got into the whole world of aviation through vintage dresses.
Oh, neat. Neat. Very neat.
And I want to give a plug for anyone that it's a long book. It's almost 500 pages, but a very wonderful person recorded the audiobook.
Yes.
Yes, and that's Stephanie Powers.
Yes, Heart to Heart.
And from Heart to Heart. And she was also, if anyone remembers the man from Uncle, she was also the girl from Uncle. She's an octogenarian. She sounds incredible.
She does indeed.
And also, a little known fact, Stephanie Powers is a pilot herself.
Oh, I didn't know that. Well, there you go. There you go.
So I hope that anyone will reach out to me. I love people. I love talking about Amelia Earhart. And people have asked me if I like Amelia Earhart at the end of 5 years of research. And the answer is yeah. I don't know if I like George Putnam, but I really do like Amelia Earhart.
Well, thank you for coming on the Pan Am podcast. And it's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Pan Am was a pioneer in air travel and still stands as one of the most iconic and innovative airlines in aviation history. That legacy lives on at the Pan Am Museum in Garden City, New York, where you can explore the rich history of the aircrafts and individuals at the heart of the company known as the world's most experienced airline. For more information about the Pan Am Museum, check out our website at www.thepanammuseum.org. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. As was once a tagline in one of our commercials, we would greatly appreciate your support to help the Pan Am Museum continue making the going great. You can also support the museum by shopping on our online store for all things Pan Am, accessories, apparel, jewelry, books, models, and posters. We want to hear from you. If you have a question for us or want to share your story, our email address is podcast@thepanammuseum.org. As flight crews once said to passengers departing for their destinations around the world, thank you for flying, Pan Am.